Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tech 2 Science Podcast, the Earth, the Space, and the Human Race. I'm Abigail,
I'm Kavya.
and in this sixth episode, we're talking to two experts. One of them is an environmental specialist, and the other is an economist and a climate specialist. Today, we're talking about what strides India is making in the name of climate action and how it fits in with the world's agenda of tackling the climate change crisis.
And today we've got with us Ulka Kelkar, who is the director at the World Resources Institute and leads the climate policy and its implementation in India. We also have joining us today Pranay Krishnan, who is the environmental specialist with the Environmental Management Center. He works with various sectors in India to help industry and financing institutions manage environmental impacts and related challenges. So thank you so much, both of you, for making time to join us today. It's going to be an exciting discussion. I can feel it.
So, with people all around the world experiencing the devastating effects of global warming, climate action is the need of the hour. So, what does climate action mean? To quote the United Nations Development Program, it is basically stepping up our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, strengthen resilience, and adapt our societies to climate induced impacts. It's not just about politics and money, it also means educating, raising awareness, and building capacity to cope with climate impacts.
Yeah. And we're in the middle of a raging pandemic right now. Ulka, I'd love to know what you think about this. Climate change is essentially still a buzzword no matter what goes on. In the past decade, we've seen that. And more companies and governments are introducing climate action plans and green bills. But been hearing for many years now that it isn't enough and we need stronger climate action. What is actually expected of countries right now to do in the name of climate change? What's expected of them? You could tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks, Kavya. Thanks, Abigail. Thank you for inviting me to this podcast. I think the challenge of climate change is that it has always been seen as a very long term problem. Climate scientists have always talked about warming and changes in rainfall happening over the scale of decades. So it is only recently that we are beginning to see the impacts, that we are feeling the urgency. I think the wildfires in in California, the kinds of flooding that we are seeing in our cities due to extreme rainfall. It's a kind of visceral experience that we are all living through right now. And that's why there is a greater sense that climate action is more urgent now than ever before. The pandemic has also played out in a very strong way in India, where we have seen migrants going back to their villages from the cities where they were working. We have seen a number of challenges in India's informal sector, the small and medium enterprises, which have had to shut down, which are facing all kinds of financial challenges. So right now, these two crises are coming very close together. Healthcare is a third way in which the pandemic and climate change touch each other very closely. So I would say that the kind of action that's needed right now is twofold. One, definitely countries need to focus on the immediate recovery and building the resilience of those who are the most vulnerable. And they can do so in a way that also addresses climate change in a positive way. For example, just recent news from Uttarakhand shows that they are talking about using MNREGA work to rejuvenate the mountain streams. So that's a way in which you can create livelihoods in the short term and also build climate resilience in the long term. And the second important way is that the kind of economic stimulus, the kinds of measures that are now being taken in order to restore the economy or to bring it out of the recession that we're in, it needs to be used in a way that does not just prop up declining industries or lock us into fossil fuel infrastructure, but can be used to create new green jobs, whether it's in renewable energy or electric vehicles or bicycles or energy storage. So again, a longer term view looking at the crisis that lies just behind the current crisis.
In Asia, India is considered to be one of the leading economies along with China and Japan. And as Uncle Ben has told us, with great power comes great responsibility. So, is India's climate action agenda, when you compare it with the other developing countries in Asia and even around the world, where does it stand basically?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me in this podcast, and it's a pleasure to be alongside Ulka as well, who's like a specialist in this area. See, India, yes, in terms of the targets, we've always been, it's been traditionally put rather that our targets are fairly ambitious, right? In terms of what we've committed as part of the Paris Agreement, we've committed a pretty ambitious target, and compared to what do you say China, which is the other nation that we're competing against in terms of carbon emissions, right, or GHG emissions, we have a fairly good setup in terms of what our targets are, in terms of what we've assessed in terms of reduction in our total emissions, in terms of moving into renewable energy as well, right? So, fairly put, yes, we are quite strong in terms of what our targets are. There are the challenges that exists there is the implementation, right? When it comes to renewable energy, for example, we are still not at a point where we can say that we're going to shift away from coal, because coal and thermal power plants in general have their own positives, right? There's much more losses in terms of efficiencies, in terms of transfers of energy from the main generating power plant into a substation and then finally back into our houses. Uh, Unfortunately or unfortunately, the coal side has been an infrastructure that has been developed over a period of time, and now we have technologies which are resulting in lesser emissions. But of course, that's not enough, right? So there is a continuous movement to go get into a better technological framework, both in terms of energy, both in terms of water, wherein we are now seeing a lot of government initiatives coming as part of policies, right? I mean, we already have the action plan on climate change that translates into a state level action plan on climate change, right? And so, in terms of policies, we are pretty robust. Now, what's lacking comparatively to other countries is that we do not have implementable regulation on climate change. If we take examples of other developing countries in the world, for example, say, I'll go a step ahead and say Australia, they've integrated climate change into almost all of their government functions. Same with New Zealand, even Chile and Costa Rica, for example, smaller nations, but they've started out policies and they've started commitments. So there's a whole movement that's going on to get net zero by 2050. The bigger aspect in terms of the largest challenge is that we do not have one governing regulation on climate change, whereas Europe, largely say the EU, which with their directives, the UK, right, the South American countries in terms of Costa Rica, Chile, even countries like Malaysia, right, even they have gone into regularizing and regulating climate change, and that is what I think we are lacking, we are lagging behind comparatively to other nations in the world.
Ulka, I want to get your opinion on this too. Till a few years ago, India's stand on climate emissions was pretty similar to other developing nations, and now it's changed and we've become more ambitious in wanting both development and net zero emissions. We're making moves towards that at least. Does development come hand in hand truly with emissions, or can we do it a different way and still keep the economy growing?
I think definitely the two can go hand in hand. It's not just in terms of jobs that I mentioned earlier, the kinds of new green jobs that can be created, but for sure in terms of our health. And there are even things like benefits for women's empowerment. So I'll just give you a few examples. In terms of jobs, do you know that in India, a minimum of 5 lakh young people enter the workforce every year? This is a very conservative estimate. And certainly, for this young workforce, given the kinds of changes that are happening in terms of the future of work, with automation, with greater globalization, we need to create new opportunities for them. And renewable energy, electric mobility, many other fields do offer these opportunities. The second is in terms of our health. So the same kinds of actions that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the power sector or in our cities would also definitely reduce the air pollution that affects our health directly. Similarly, when women who use biomass still for cooking in our country, if they can switch away to better fuels, this would directly have a positive impact on their health. India is one of the few countries where, in the last few years, we are seeing that women's participation in the workforce has been declining. Partly this is because of good reasons, because women are studying for longer, but it's also because they need more access to employment opportunities, and public transport is one way, one part of the solution that helps them to do that. Another way in which development and climate action can go hand in hand is in terms of water. India is a highly water-stressed country, and we find that renewable energy plants use less water than thermal power plants, such as coal power plants. So this is also a way of conserving our scarce water resources and making them available for urban use, for agricultural use. But having said that, there are many details that we need to get right in order for development and climate action to actually go hand in hand. It's not a given, it's not guaranteed. For example, with renewable energy, a better way of providing clean energy is to go through what is called decentralized renewable energy options. For example, for rural hospitals or rural schools, you could set up small solar plants or other kinds of equipment, which would enable these hospitals to run even when there is a cut in the conventional electricity, or even if they're off the grid, they're located in very remote areas. But the trick over here is that the financial support needs to be provided to these rural areas in order to adopt these decentralized options. Similarly, for our cities, rooftop solar power is a really good option for cities to generate and use their own electricity, rather than to have electricity coming from very distant locations.
Pranay, you have mentioned about the National Action Plan on Climate Change, and to give our listeners a little bit of a background, it was launched 12 years ago, and it basically looks at 8 different areas, and some of them are solar energy and sustainable habitats, water, agriculture, just to name a few. And it's a pretty comprehensive and tailored plan that suits India's needs. How is it faring 12 years on? And would you say the plan is maybe a little lower in ambition and to tackle basically India's climate change?
I wouldn't say the plan is lower in ambition, because in terms of its coverage areas, it's definitely had it has 8 sectors, and it definitely covers a wide variety of scopes, right? But I think what's happening is there's no transparency in understanding how the National Action Plan for Climate Change has progressed over a period of time. That said, that doesn't mean that we haven't done things over a period of time, right? So specifically, for example, in the space of solar, we've set up the International Solar Alliance, and we're one of the leading nations in the world. And like Ulka mentioned, there's a large scope for renewable energy, specifically with solar PV. And the capacity that India has in order to harness solar energy is one of the highest in the world, right? So that's one positive thing. We have come up with electric vehicles. There's a policy right now that by 2030 we would go into only having electric vehicles. Same with biofuels. The ministry right now, I think last month, the honorable ministers put out a statement suggesting companies to transition into blended fuels, including biofuels. Right. In terms of tree plantations, we've got the afforestation program. Right. In terms of waste management and pollution control, we've made our regulations much more stringent, and that's a big positive, because the 6 waste management regulations that we got out in 2016, right, it not only looked at what is called as residue, which is basically the waste, but it also started looking at what is the resource, which is the material that is used from which this waste is generated, right? So that's the transition that we are seeing in India. Energy efficiency has always been something that has happened irrespective of the National Action Plan. The larger problem with climate change is that it has always been seen as an externality, right? It's only now that we're trying to integrate it into our systems in almost all fronts, right? So, for example, even in agriculture, I remember doing this project with NABARD, which is called the Umbrella Program for National Forest in India, right? So they had climate resilience in agriculture as one of the key mandates as part of that program. There's a fund of 5 million that has gone into agriculture funding, specifically in Maharashtra, right? Wherein then they're looking at watershed management, they're looking at integrated pest management. There's more studies that are done on climate resilience agriculture, right? So there are programs that are happening, coming up. And back a couple of years ago, we got in the draft National Action Plan for Resource Efficiency, right? So that's another important step, and that's a very ambitious plan, because it's not only taken elements from the National Action Plan for climate change, but it's also added aspects such as life cycle assessment, circular economy into the mix. And that's where I think, in terms of policy, like I said, we are stepping up and we are slowly progressing. Is it adequate? Is it good enough? We do not have enough data to probably apportion that, but but there is movement happening, sure.
We're easily a few decades away from having a clean source, something like nuclear energy that is without a doubt going to cut emissions and slash them by a considerable amount, right? And India, we have been seeing incremental advances in renewable energy without a doubt, but we're still not pursuing clean energy as aggressively as we could be. Ulka, why do you think that is? Is there a good enough reason for us not to be doing that if it's such an important goal to prioritize under climate action?
Thanks, Kavya. I think there are some rather simple reasons and some rather complex reasons why we have not been able to do this more aggressively. In the simple side, I think Pranay spoke earlier about integration. Often what happens is a lot of different actions have to be taken by a lot of different departments, or they have to happen at different scale, something at the national level, something at the state level, something at the city level. So this horizontal integration across department and vertical integration across scales sometimes is more difficult than it should be. That becomes a bottleneck. The second, again, is the issue of enforcement. Often we do have policies, but their enforcement takes longer. For example, the Energy Conservation Building Code in India actually specifies how buildings should be greener, more energy efficient, use the right kinds of materials, have the right kind of thermal comfort, just using solar passive architecture without the need for very energy intensive appliances. But the enforcement needs to happen at the level of cities. The adoption needs to happen by architects, and the social culture in some sense needs to change. People have to be happy with this kind of housing. They have to be willing to adopt these energy efficient appliances and styles of architecture. So there's a lot that gets missed out at the implementation or enforcement scale, even if there are policies. And the third kind of easy easy gap or simple gap is the issue of business models. As I said, for example, for small and medium enterprises, if they were to adopt clean energy interventions, these interventions would actually pay for themselves. But the bottleneck comes that they cannot afford even those small amounts of upfront capital. They are in debt, they find it difficult to access formal finance, and they find it hard to put up these small amounts of money. So sometimes we need business models that would shift this upfront requirement to something like paying over the period of time, just like you would pay for, say, a Netflix subscription or for your internet use. You're paying for the service over time rather than paying for the entire product or the entire service upfront and then having to recover the costs. Just a simple switch like this, making it easy for people to access finance and pay for the service over time, would make a tremendous difference. But of course, everything is not so simple. There are some difficult challenges as well. In some cases, we need to actually start investing now in research and development. You mentioned nuclear energy, but I would say right now, there's a lot of action that's happening on energy storage. After all, renewable energy is intermittent. You can generate it only when the sun shines and the wind blows. So in the meantime, you need to store it for rainy days or cloudy days, or when there is a cyclone, or when it's night. So energy storage is something that is, again, dependent on a lot of minerals that may not be available in India, that we may need to import from other countries, from other continents. So we need to develop battery chemistries that are suited to our conditions, that our electric vehicles can run on in Indian road conditions. Green hydrogen is another big field that is opening up. That is, can you produce hydrogen from renewable electricity so that you don't even need to be dependent on the kinds of batteries that we are currently seeing, but you can use this hydrogen in a number of different industries as well as in transport. Finally, there is no doubt that in some cases there would be strong actions required that would have adverse impacts on some communities, on some parts of our society. And we need to recognize that and we need to prepare for that. So just as we are talking about a clean energy transition, shutting down inefficient power plants that are polluting our air and water, we also need to recognize the fact that there are people whose jobs depend on coal mining, on railways that transport this coal, on power plants that produce electricity from this coal. And we need to make sure that the transition in energy is accompanied by a just transition, a fair and equitable transition in jobs and livelihoods as well. And for that, we need to make sure that there is social dialogue, that there are safety nets that people can access, that they can upskill or reskill themselves and access new jobs, and also that they can access finance to set up new small businesses that are cleaner and greener. So there are a number of actions that need to happen which make this process not so simple, but it needs to be done, and it's something that can be spread out over the period of time. So we do have about a decade in which to make sure that we shift towards clean energy, but in doing so also generate better livelihoods, more dignified lives, better health, and access to water for our people.
So, in the month of March, the government introduced the Environmental Impact Assessment draft of the EIA, and it's basically the government's way of trying to give companies or institutes environmental clearances are much make it much more easier for them to get it. So, does this have a part to play in the larger climate action policy in India?
EIA has largely been something that has always looked to assess impacts and mitigate it. And that said, it has always looked at residue. That's the waste coming or the immediate impact getting out of that particular process. Unfortunately, we've still followed that same course, right? We're still looking at a very project-specific implementation. The larger gap that exists is strategic level implementation or regional level implementation, right? The world has gone much ahead of us in terms of what we call as the environmental impact assessment. Right now, if you just look at environmental impact assessment, it's only one small part of what is called as impact assessment. There is much more coming in terms of regional impact assessment, strategic impact assessment, policy impact assessment. Right, and what if I just have to explain all of these in short words is that a regional level impact assessment looks at a particular area, a particular region, calculates the impacts, calculates the baseline, and assesses how a particular industry or infrastructure that the government wants to get into that particular area will affect that area. Now, that would be of so much more help in assessing a particular project rather than having 10 projects in the same area having their own independent impacts assessed, right? And then get measures that are specific only to their project. Now, same thing is a strategic level. So if you want to get into something like a renewable power being your primary source of power, which is something that we still are very ambitious with, right? We need to get that level of impact assessment, because when we say impact assessment, now we talk about renewable power as being a clean source of power. Yes, it does not have emissions, but there are things that it requires. In terms of solar PV plants, right? If you remove rooftop solar out, if you're looking at large-scale solar farms, it requires humongous amounts of land, right? And that's not easy and accessible land. And again, land management becomes a very big very, very crucial thing. So in Karnataka, for example, which is a rich solar state, right? There are agricultural parcels of land that are being used to cultivate solar farms. Now, you have what do you say? You're getting into renewable energy and you're getting into better climate change mitigation measures, right? But you're also losing land, which is going to lead to lesser agricultural productivity, right? So there are counter impacts that we need to consider, and the EIA draft, in that sense, has not truly taken climate change in its purview. If you are going to be in a drought-prone region, you cannot allow companies who require water to get water there in any form. right? Not only because they're going to be using, say, water from that particular area, but they're also going to be needing to transport water from that point. Agricultural land, or maybe areas with large scale forests, right? Something like, say, a 60-70% tree density, right? These areas, they were made a no-go land just because of the sanctity that they have in terms of the carbon sink that it provides, the ecosystem and the biodiversity that it conserves, right? And then obviously the overall contribution to climate change, right? So the EIA draft at this point of time does not assess climate change at all. It's still maybe an upgraded version, I can say, in terms of its processes from the 2006 notification. It doesn't really solve the climate crisis as such that we're talking about right now.
I'm also curious to know if the ones you mentioned earlier, the regional and the national impact assessment, is something that India is already working on. Is there some movement towards that, or are we still waiting to get on that ship?
Yeah. So in terms of strategic impact assessment, strategic environmental assessments, we are still way off, right? We've done it, but not because it is a regulatory requirement. It is been enforced, and a large scale force, specifically in India, right? In terms of implementation, that's the challenge that you're looking at, right? It is through financing institutions. When I say financing institutions, it can be the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, country level funds, right? And also funds of funds. So these larger institutions fund smaller companies, who in turn go and fund smaller projects. So there's a line of credit that goes along there. So one of the most robust EIA processes in the world is that developed by the World Bank, right? So they have obviously integrated EIA into its process, and similarly other institutions. And that's how we've seen strategic assessments happen, right? But at a project level, India has still not gone there. You'll be surprised that even Bangladesh has a certain level of strategic environmental assessments compared to India, right? So with the impact assessment side, we'll be definitely lagging behind. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on a strategic and a regional level. It's very important in India to assess them on a regional level.
We've heard over the course of the pandemic that a lot of sectors have seen a unique opportunity to kind of rebuild their systems and assess where we can make important changes we need to make. And like you mentioned earlier, I think healthcare is definitely one of those sectors, and it's come under a lot of scrutiny. Is there a similar kind of window of opportunity for climate action right now?
Thanks, Kavya. That's a great question. And I want to actually tie it to your previous question about the EIA. One of the important things that the EIA process lets us do is to actually talk to the people who are affected directly by a given project. So Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, these countries, in fact, have local adaptation plans of action, where the local community has got together to discuss what makes them vulnerable to climate change and what kinds of actions are required at the local level. So community knowledge and community solutions, bringing them into so-called expert assessments, is definitely something that is required. And that is something that has really been at the heart of what this recent pandemic crisis, and also things like the Black Lives Matter movement, the anti-racism action in the United States has recently shown us, which is that we really need to make people at the heart of building resilience, preparing for future shocks, whether we are talking about another pandemic, or whether we are talking about an economic crisis, or whether we are talking about climate action. Financial institutions are divesting from fossil fuel intensive projects, whether it is the World Bank or even the Japanese banks that were continuing to fund coal. Corporates are making announcements about becoming net zero, like Unilever, for example, made a very big announcement recently. So all these actions will happen provided there is a long-term regulatory signal, that there is long-term regulatory certainty that we are going to go in this direction and there is no looking back. One way in which we do this at WRI India is by working with companies to adopt a voluntary internal carbon price. So you put a price on your carbon dioxide emissions and deal with it in your decision making, just as you would with buying energy or buying water. The other window of opportunity is that to build better cities. We have seen in our recent kinds of extreme events and floods that we discover that there are airport runways that have been built on floodplains. And then we are surprised when the river floods over or an extreme rainfall happens, where we've built cities where everything is paved over and the water has nowhere to go. So there is a need to do ecological zoning, to give more emphasis to public transport, non-motorized transport, walkability, bicycles, all of that. So many of our cities, not the mega cities, but many of our smaller cities are growing, are booming. We need to make them a more welcoming place, not just for migrant workers, but even for children, for women, for elderly. There are many problems that can be solved if we use this window opportunity and build right. And finally, I think the pandemic has taught us a healthy respect for nature, a respect for the more minimalist lifestyle. I think we've all realized what we can do without buying, we can do without traveling, we can do without frequent holidays. And I think that is something that, in terms of the way we consume and the way we live, is a window of opportunity that we must not lose. We must not forget about the lessons that we have learned during this pandemic and apply the same thing in our approach to climate action.
There is this thing on what we know as science-based targets that's come out of the Paris Agreement, right? India is right now ranked 5th in the number of companies who have subscribed to science-based targets, right? And ahead of, obviously, we are ahead of Germany and Sweden as well. So when you mention about internal carbon pricing, when you talk about emission reductions or going net zero, right? So all these smaller points that you see in terms of energy efficiency, water efficiency, right, in terms of conservation of resources or lesser material management, in terms of what we know as cleaner production or resource efficiency, right? Now, science-based targets capture all of this in order to ensure that your net emissions or net carbon emissions are lower or go zero. These are targets that overall help the country, reduce its carbon emissions or achieve its targets that have been declared in the Paris Agreement.
WRI, the organization I work for, is actually one of the organizations that is part of the Science-Based Target Initiative. I think one of the fears that people have with companies making announcements about clean action is that it's kind of greenwashing, that they're just announcing something, but they won't actually make a real difference. So what the Science-Based Target Initiative helps to do is make sure that the target you announce is in line with your contribution to the climate change problem. So if you're from a very fossil fuel intensive company, if you're a very large company with a large footprint, then your target will be higher. And you will also be helped to find opportunities that help you to bring down that target over time. And the targets that all the companies that sign up for collectively are trying to address the global target that that the Earth needs to be within in order to make sure that we are within safe bounds of climate change. So the idea is that you don't just make any announcement that you feel like, but you make sure that it is in line with what is required really in order to tackle the problem.
Now there is an increased focus in investing in India. Now the good part that comes out with investing in India is that, like I mentioned, right, a lot larger financial institutions in the world, they have environmental and social considerations ingrained as part of their investment policy. Larger corporations, right? So for example, a Siemens or an Amazon. Now, if these companies come in and increase investments in India, increase taxes in India, that's a very big opportunity that we're looking at. And maybe not, obviously, there is a requirement for policy level interventions, but there's also a large scale participation from private sector. So I think India is right. If I just put it in one line, India is looking at an opportunity where there is a lot of potential for public sector and private integration in the space of environmental and social sustainability and thus climate change.
I've been working in this field for 20 years now, and I'm seeing now so much activity from government, from corporate, from media, and from young people. So in terms of the government, for example, in a lot of policies now, there is explicit mention of climate change. For example, India now has a policy on how to make sure that we meet our cooling requirements, our air conditioning, refrigeration, and space cooling requirements in a more sustainable way. We are hosting this International Solar Alliance, which is for countries that can generate a lot of solar energy. On the corporate side, I think Pranay has given a number of examples how corporates are taking action. But I think the media is reporting more and more on climate change issues in a way that it highlights the people aspect, the economic aspect, So I think that's just amazing, the kind of awareness that exists now, and the young people. I mean, we all know about Greta Thunberg and the Sunrise Movement in and Fridays for the Future and all of that. I think the point is that even my 12-year-old daughter knows a lot about climate change and questions me, "Mummy, what are you doing about this? And what are we doing?" So I think the level of awareness is increasing, and programs such as yours can serve to even more take this message to outside the environmental community in which it has been restricted so far.
I see a lot of NGOs at this point of time who are getting environmental education into the lower levels of education, right? And this is not now only limited to private schools, right? Even BMC schools, even schools that are run by the government. There are NGOs going and conducting a monthly program. They're telling them about the importance of trees. They're telling them about the importance of animals. And these are smaller aspects. And I've myself seen examples where the kid tells the mom or the dad that don't throw, right? If that's something that we're ingraining as values right now, I think that's a very positive future that we're looking out.
Thank you so much, Ulka and Pranay.
Thank you very much, Abigail. Thank you, Kavya. It's been a pleasure. Nice
Thank
being on the panel with you, Brian.
Thank you, Abigail. Thank you, Kav.
That's it from this week's podcast. Join us next week where we'll be discussing whether India has homegrown solutions to solving malnutrition. If you have any questions you would like to ask our experts, send them over to us on any of our social media platforms. Until then, this is Abigail and Kavya signing off. Catch you later on the Earth, Space, and the Human Race podcast.